This past weekend saw the release of Dark Phoenix, the final chapter in Fox's groundbreaking X-Men film franchise. Based on initial reaction, it seems that both critics and fans have been thoroughly underwhelmed by the way the long-running series went out. Unfortunately, if you've ever played any of the X-Men games, you'll be all too familiar with disappointing conclusions. To prove that point, we're gonna celebrate Wolverine, Cyclops, Jean Grey, and the rest of the mutants by looking at a whole bunch of X-Men games released in the 1980s and 90s. So turn back now if you don't want to know what happens next, because today we're gonna spoil the stories and endings for pretty much every 8 and 16-bit X-Men game. This is Game Over, the early years. Despite not getting a movie until the year 2000, the X-Men already had a major presence on home consoles thanks to a string of 8 and 16-bit games on a wide variety of systems. For this video, I'm going to focus on the early console releases, saving the portable releases, including the Game Gear trilogy, for another day. I'm also going to skip over the fighting games and the big team-ups, like X-Men vs. Street Fighter and Spider-Man and X-Men in Arcade's Revenge. Look, I'm gonna need to have something to talk about in the off chance that they actually release that new Mutants movie next year. Anyway, our journey begins exactly 30 years ago when LJN published the very first X-Men video game. It was the Uncanny X-Men, and it gave us our first pixelized look at popular characters like Colossus, Cyclops, Iceman, Nightcrawler, Storm, and Wolverine. This is a pretty straightforward fight between good and evil, with the nefarious Magneto trying to take over the world by assembling strange and magical beings and creating an army of mutant-killing robots. Oh, and did I mention that he found a new type of life form in space that can emit a burst of mind-controlling energy? Well, he intends to use the magical beings, robots, and mind-controlling slugs to turn everybody into a bunch of slaves and live in a self-made utopia. Now, the X-Men are not going to let this stand, so they team up to take down Magneto. This turns out to be a whole lot more complicated than it needs to be, because you can only enter the final stage using a cheat code. You see, part of the code was printed on the cartridge label, and the other parts were hidden in the text at the end of each level. Wait a second, that's not how you spell Abel! Anyway, you toss in this code and have to go up against Magneto in this very blue and yellow stage. When you finally defeat Magneto and find the exit, this is what happens next. So, I'm not sure what the best X-Men game is, but I can tell you right now that the best subtitle goes to X-Men Madness in Murderworld. This is the oft-forgotten Commodore 64 game released in 1989 and developed by Paragon Software. That's an interesting hybrid that mixes side-scrolling action with point-and-click adventuring. The game takes Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Cyclops, Colossus, Storm, and Dazzler to a dangerous amusement park known as Murderworld. Apparently, Arcade and Magneto have teamed up to kidnap Professor X. So it's up to our heroes to fight through a frustratingly confusing maze of identical hallways in order to save the day. This mission eventually takes us to this castle setting, where we have to assemble a demagnetizer by using the power booster to create a power supply. And then we use the bud cable to create an emitter, use the emitter on a controller to create a degausser, use the degausser to create a demagnetizer, and then use all of that to defeat the force field and save Professor X. Depending on how well you did, you either get the good or bad ending. Here are both of those. Only a year after Madness in Murderworld, Paragon Software returns with X-Men 2: The Fall of the Mutants. This is a much more straightforward outing where the emphasis is on action instead of puzzle solving. It's a different spin on the Fall of the Mutants comic book crossover from just a couple of years earlier. In this version of the story, Storm and Forge get caught up in some sort of time warp and abducted by a new villain known as the Adversary. We're told right at the start by the Watcher that this is sort of a what-if tale to see what would happen if a different team fought the Adversary. That's a fun approach that gives us a chance to play as a bunch of different characters you don't normally see in these types of games. I mean, I'm talking about Longshot, the Phoenix incarnation of Rachel Summers, and even Jean Grey's punk daughter from an alternate future. You get to pick your team and move the pieces around an overhead map and then defeat the enemies in a number of side-scrolling fights. We eventually make our way to the Starlight Citadel, where we have to go head-to-head against the Adversary. We kick his ass, and depending on what characters you choose, this is what happens next. At long last, 1992 brought us an X-Men game that's actually worth playing. Leave it to Konami to create an action-packed, side-scrolling arcade beat-em-up that actually captures the spirit of the comic books. It's the 21st century, and Magneto is once again using the army of killer robots to try to destroy the world. But don't worry, because Cyclops, Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, and Dazzler are ready to take on a whole host of supervillains. This sends our heroes into the streets to kick mutant ass, but it was a trap. While they were out beating up Sentinels, Magneto kidnaps Professor X and Kitty Pryde. Our job is simple. We need to find a way to Island M and save our friends. Long story short, we locate the island and beat up the inhabitants. After an intense fight through the jungle, Charles Xavier shows us a secret passageway through the temple. But wait, that's not Professor X, it's Mystique luring us into a trap! We end up going up against a trio of Egyptian statues that come to life and try to kill the mutants. We win, of course, but the real Professor X informs the X-Men that Magneto plans on attacking the Earth from his asteroid base. We have no other choice but to chase them down and try to stop the attack, which means defeating all the previous bosses for a second time, because it's a beat-em-up released in the 1990s. We eventually make our way to Magneto, who has Charles trapped in some sort of electrical field. After a whole lot of punching, we end up knocking Magneto out, and oh no, we were tricked once again by Mystique. Why does that keep happening? The real Magneto is in another room, which means it's time to kick his ass all over again. He tries to use his powers against you, but fails and is defeated by a few choice swipes to the face. This is what happens next. Now, after seeing Konami, LJN, and Paragon Software take a stab at the mutants, Sega decided to step up and make one of the more memorable console adaptations. Sega's first X-Men game hit the Genesis in 1993 and sees us playing as Wolverine, Gambit, Cyclops, and Nightcrawler, a real sausage fest. Watch out, mutants, because a virus has infected the Danger Room and our heroes are forced to endure a wide range of unpredictable scenarios. But things are not as they appear, because Magneto was behind the virus and hoped that it would take out the X-Men for good. His plan fails, and we track down Magneto in his space base. He puts up a good fight, but we win the day, and this is what happens next. So, if you're sick of every X-Men game revolving around Magneto trying to do something terrible, then let me introduce you to X-Men 2, Clone Wars, the second Genesis outing from Sega. This tells the story of an alien race known as the Failings who have contaminated a Sentinel factory. Professor X sends Beast, Psylocke, Gambit, Nightcrawler, Wolverine, and Cyclops to investigate, but discover that the virus is spread all the way to Magneto's home base of Avalon. This leads to an unlikely team-up where the X-Men and Magneto work together to defeat the Failings before assimilating humanity and taking control of Earth. This is a fun excuse to take us all around the world and pit the X-Men against some of our favorite villains, including Apocalypse, Brainchild, and Deathbird. We eventually make our way to the Sentinel factory and prepare to defeat the Failings once and for all. Wouldn't you know it, they have one last trick up their alien sleeves. In order to defeat them, the X-Men are going to need to fight clones of themselves. We do this one at a time, and this is what happens next. In case you haven't noticed, most of the 8 and 16-bit endings have been, well, kinda terrible. It's usually just a still image or wall of text, or sometimes both. The good news is that we're going to end this episode of Game Over by looking at what is certainly the best ending of the bunch, and it comes from the game X-Men Mutant Apocalypse on the Super NES. This is one of those Marvel games released by Capcom in the mid-1990s. It reminds me a lot of Marvel Superheroes in War of the Gems, a game we looked at back in April. Mutant Apocalypse starts out simple enough. The island of Genosha is a known prison where Apocalypse is keeping mutants captive. Professor X sends Beast, Cyclops, Gambit, Psylocke, and, of course, Wolverine to free the mutants and save the day. But things are more complicated than they first appear because Magneto duped the X-Men and plans on destroying Genosha. This sets up the final epic 16-bit confrontation with Magneto inside the space station Avalon. He tries throwing loose metal objects at us, but all it takes is a few well-timed punches and kicks to take the supervillain down. And this is what happens next. Unlike the Godzilla games we looked at a couple of weeks ago, there are a number of genuinely fun X-Men games out there. Mutant Apocalypse and Clone Wars fully understand what people love about the X-Men characters. And seriously, who can forget about Konami's arcade game? The problem is that most of the stories are pretty weak, and the endings are even worse. For as much money as Sega put into those two Genesis games, the endings feel like a complete afterthought. And it's not just Sega, but almost every company responsible for an X-Men game. I mean, LJN didn't even try. Even the mildly interesting Mutant Apocalypse ending is still pretty bland. About the best we could do was hope that the next ending would be better. And if you think about it, that's true of Dark Phoenix as well. Fox's X-Men franchise is over, and the ending was disappointing. About the best we can do now is hope that Psylocke, Gambit, and especially Jubilee fare better in the MCU, whenever that happens. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Game Over, The Early Years. If you like what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every Monday. Now here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite X-Men game? I don't know why I think this, but I have a hunch the answer is going to be the Konami arcade game. I think you're going to say that arcade game. No matter what, let me see your picks in the comments below. Oh, also, if you haven't checked out our Godzilla Game Over episode from a couple of weeks ago, I want to pimp it out right now. It's very similar to this one, only with a bunch of Godzilla endings. And most of them are bad. That's not a great way to sell this episode. Anyway, you should go watch it. Seriously. Also, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.